Good morning, Professor Lahiri.
Hello.
So, can you please tell us how would you define antiquarianism?
The thing is that usually antiquarianism is described as as something which concerns a deep interest in and also a collection and documentation of artifacts and relics in different parts of the world by different groups of people. In the Indian context, when we think of antiquarianism, usually, if you look at books on the history of Indian archaeology, there are two types of antiquarians who figure. One is European travelers who came for other reasons. They didn't come here to collect, but they got deeply interested in the past. And the second are, archaeologists and scholars who are trained in the Western tradition. And even Indians who became a part of the Archaeological Survey of India or other such organizations are very much within that mold. So that's the usual definition of antiquarianism.
Right. So, sometimes ancient sculptures or artifacts, often unearthed by villagers, are sometimes worshipped in local groves or shrines. Can we expand the definition of antiquarianism to understand and analyze such living traditions, which are prevalent almost all over the country?
Yes, of course. In fact, that's what I've tried to do. And the way I see it, I would call it living antiquarianism. And it's absolutely fascinating because the fact of the matter is, just like, let's say, the European travelers who came, it's not as if they were here to write history, but they were interested in past relics which were around the Indian countryside, and they described them and so on and so forth frequently. In the same way, you have villagers in different parts of India who have a deep interest in anything that is quaint and which seems old and which seems to relate to the past history of where they stay. And those are then collected and worshipped. They are integrated into the belief systems of the local area and so on and so forth. So I would definitely call that, because it's the same kind of deep interest that they have. And as with the case of many early antiquarians, these are not people who are doing it within an institutional framework. They're doing it because they find this very interesting, and they're doing it because they feel this needs to be preserved because it relates to the past of where they stay. And you think of antiquarianism as part of the history of Indian archaeology in a very early context, but this shows you that antiquarianism actually is a continuing practice.
So, do you think that such an association with the past plays a role in shaping a sense of identity of the region or the locale?
I think it makes people treat the past as being spiritually important and religiously important, and to that extent it does shape their identities. Also, these artifacts and relics that you find, broken monuments, relict sculpture and so on and so forth, they belong to various traditions. So you will have Jain sculpture, cheek by jowl with Hindu deities, and you will find the jinns associated with monuments, Islamic monuments in the vicinity and so on. So in a sense, this also then creates an idea that the identity of the people who inhabit this place is multi-communal. It's not a single kind of identity. There are diverse things that constitute what you consider to be the pasts of those places.
So, have such practices emerged because of a lack of initiative on part of the government or the ASI to preserve the artifacts, or do you think it's a deliberate choice?
I think it's a deliberate choice, and it's a very old practice. So you can see, if you look at the old archaeological reports, you can actually find instances. At Bhita, for instance, which is near Allahabad, you will find all kinds of neoliths placed in a room where there is, the bust of Shiva and probably other deities on a little platform. So what was produced were neoliths in very early context, but they've been collected by people of the historical period and they worship. So it's actually a very old practice. It doesn't have to do with the way in which institutions of which are integral to the government have treated those monuments. It's an old practice.
Okay. Can you tell us a little about your fieldwork and share a couple of experiences about how you witnessed this?
Well, actually when I began my fieldwork in Vallabhgarh, I was doing this with Upinder Singh and subsequently for a little while with Tarika Oberoi. Tarika didn't stay in archaeology. She went on to become, a government officer, and I hope she carries some of this with her. But on the one hand, we were looking at places which yielded pottery, sculpture, and so on and so forth. But to our amazement, we started finding that a lot of this sculpture is actually to be found in folk shrines. And for me at least, that meant relearning what I had learned about the history of religion. If you look at religious practices, you're always told that broken sculpture shouldn't be worshipped, but it is continuously worshipped all over the place. So it came out, I wasn't looking for this, but and as often happens in the field, you find things which you weren't looking for, and then they become the starting point of another kind of research at a later point. So what I then did was I started encouraging others to do this kind of work. So I've had students who have looked for such relics. There's Aditi Man, who's done it for Delhi, and there is Diliraj Sharma, who as a part of his PhD thesis, he was from the Tribhuvan University in Nepal. So his work was on the stone art actually of Nepal. But along with that, he did this kind of documentation. And then as I went around different parts, of India, I found a whole lot of places having the same practice. So I can say with great confidence that this isn't something which begins and ends in North India. It's a practice which you can find across the Indian subcontinent.
Just a final question: Do you think it's a valuable or a viable mode of conservation? Wouldn't the artifacts be safer in a museum away from the daily rituals of worship, which can potentially damage them?
So there are two issues here. I don't think that worship can damage them in the way in which, let's say, just ignoring them in the basement of a museum where they haven't even been catalogued can. At least in the case of shrines, there are people who care for this. Who have integrated them into their worship practices, and that's why they have survived. And in many instances, one knows that when people have documented these and they have got stolen, the documentation of scholars of these places has led to the recovery. As for what happens to them when they are worshipped, that oil is put on them and vermilion and so on and so forth, I think there is an issue there. But again, there is outreach that is required, where you can ask communities, request them to use materials for worship which may not damage these sculptures.